Hello everyone, I'm Jean-Philippe Combe. I became an affiliate of the Planetary Science Institute last May, and today I'm going to summarize where I come from, my educational background, professional experience, and what I'm looking for at PSI. I was born and I grew up in southern France, very close to the impact location of the Juvinas meteorite, which parent body is likely asteroid Vesta. That place is also in the same administrative division as the manufacture of the first manned hot air balloon by the Montgolfier brothers. I studied physics and applied physics, including signal processing, remote sensing, and geoscience. I got a master's degree with a specialty in dynamics of the Earth and telluric planets, during which I participated in testing the calibration of the Lunar Prospector Gamma Ray and Neutron Detector. For a PhD thesis, I began studying planetary surfaces with visible near-infrared imaging spectrometry, and this is what I have done ever since. First, I processed airborne data in collaboration with biologists to evaluate the biomass of microalgae. Then I worked with geologists to study an ophiolite in the Oman Sultanate. And finally, when Mars Express started its orbiting mission in 2004, I analyzed spectra acquired by the Omega instrument, and I started developing an algorithm of spectral mixing that I still use today. In 2005, I met Thomas McCord, thanks to my PhD advisor Christophe Sautin. At the time, Tom had recently retired as a professor at University of Hawaii, but he continued as a researcher by founding the Barefoot Institute in Winthrop, Washington State. When I met Tom, he was looking for another scientist, and I was hired in June 2006. Thanks to Tom, I became a member of several instrument and space mission teams, such as the high-resolution stereo camera on Mars Express, to study Mars and Phobos, and also for working on the cross-calibration with the Omega imaging spectrometer. I worked with VIMS on Cassini to study the surface composition of Titan and the distribution of CO2 on Enceladus. I was part of the Moon Mineralogy Mapper team on Chandrayaan-1, mostly to study hydroxyl and temporal variations. I worked with Virtis M on Rosetta to analyze the temporal variations in the composition and temperature of the nucleus of comet 611P Churyumov-Gerasimenko. And finally, I was part of the Dawn mission at Vesta and Ceres, for which I did a lot of global mapping. I was mostly involved with the VR mapping spectrometer. Eventually, I became a co-investigator of the Dawn mission at Ceres. A few months ago, Tom began the process of closing down the Barefoot Institute, so here I am now at PSI. I would like to say a few words about imaging spectrometry. Reflectance spectrometry measures the flux of photons from the observed area as a function of the wavelength. With imaging spectrometry, each pixel is a spectrum. Its main application is to analyze the composition of surfaces and atmospheres. In reflectance spectrometry, the measured light flux is sensitive to various physical properties of all the materials that interact with photons. To interpret a spectrum, the challenge is to separate each of these effects. I'm going to focus on the surface materials because this is more my specialty than the atmosphere. Practically, absorptions are the most diagnostic properties of the surface material in the spectra because they are sensitive to the molecular composition, such as the minerals, ices, organic matter, to name a few. To study the composition, the absorbing properties need to be isolated from other variables, because the flux of incident light is sensitive to multiple parameters such as atmospheric absorptions, multiple scattering, the topography, the distance to the sun, and so on. Scattering on the surface material is sensitive to roughness and porosity, and in the spectra, it results in nonlinear mixing. Finally, thermal emission contributes also to adding photons to the flux of light reflected and scattered by the surface. It is sensitive to the surface temperature, the physical structure of the material, and the intrinsic emissivity, so this needs to be corrected or minimized to study the composition. The physics of radiative transfer is a way to model and interpret the spectra, but it is always limited by the fact that there are more unknown variables than known parameters. In particular, one of the toughest challenges is to separate the effects of absorptions, thermal emission, and photometry. This is one of the problems I am the most interested in at the moment, and to make things more complicated, absorption bands are also sensitive to the temperature of the surface material. Absorptions are sensitive to the nature and abundance of the surface components, which is the primary information that we are looking for. In the problem we are facing here, absorptions are in competition with photometric and temperature effects. Before I illustrate that, I would like to emphasize why it matters. First, large quantities of data from imaging spectrometers have never been interpreted because of this problem. For example, the down via spectra of Vesta between 3 and 5 microns. 2. For quantitative analysis, absorption band depth variations due to temperature or phase variations could be mistaken for abundance variations. So let's start with thermal emission, with reflectance spectra of lunar samples at different temperatures. At room temperature, they show a broad absorption between 2.7 and 3 microns due to OH and possibly H2O. As the temperature increases, thermal emission makes the spectra to increase sharply as a function of the wavelength, which results in filling the absorption bands. When the surface within the field of view of the spectrometer has a homogeneous temperature, thermal emission can be modeled with a Planck function. The position of the maximum is sensitive to the temperature, as illustrated on the right. However, there are two difficulties. The surface temperature cannot be calculated accurately with most imaging spectrometers because their range of wavelengths does not reach where the maximum of thermal emission occurs. For example, the Moon Mineralogy Mapper stops at 3 microns, as in the spectra on the left. 2. Surface roughness results in a distribution of temperatures within the field of view, and this distribution varies as a function of the incident sunlight and the emergence angle. In the graph on the right, the curve of thermal emission actually results in a combination of Planck functions for different temperatures. The temperature of the surface material also changes the position, depth, and symmetry of the absorption bands. Certain absorption bands are more sensitive than others to temperature variations. The phase angle has two effects. First, generally, with increasing phase, there is a decrease of the apparent overall brightness. This is why mapping of reflectance with data acquired from different mission phases requires a phase function correction as illustrated on the left. Second, with increasing phase, there is an increase of the apparent absorption band depth as shown on the right. And again, some absorption bands are more sensitive than others. To summarize, absorptions are in competition with thermal emission. There is a sensitivity of apparent brightness and the absorption band depth to the phase angle. There is a sensitivity of the absorption band depth, position, and symmetry to the temperature. So this is what results in more unknown than known variables. The approach to solve this problem is to use temperature information that is independent from the measured spectra. Temperature could be measured from a different instrument. However, there are very few examples of databases with overlapping observations from a visible near-infrared spectrometer and a thermal infrared spectrometer. So, alternatively, one strategy is firstly to use a physical model such as the one developed by Banfield et al. In 2008, and secondly, to document the sensitivity to temperature of the shape of the absorption bands along with the intrinsic absorption properties called the optical constants, which require laboratory measurements of samples. As I mentioned before, this is an ongoing effort, and I wanted to talk about it because, for me, it is a way to present my area of expertise to the scientists at PSI. My objective at PSI is to collaborate with other scientists that are specialists in their own domains of planetary science, and who may make use of the helping hands of a spectroscopist. Since I had the opportunity to study many objects of the solar system, with various instruments and space missions, there may be a chance that I have already processed the spectral data that some of you may need, or that I have already encountered problems that you are trying to solve. So my priority is to be involved in proposals, and I am also open to participate in any ongoing efforts for publications. Thank you for listening, and I hope for a fruitful collaboration in the future.